Good Thursday morning, everybody. Welcome into your FreightWaves Now Community Spotlight. I'm Kaylee Nix here with Thomas Wasson, our enterprise trucking expert here at FreightWaves. It's time to get you updated on what's going on in the enterprise trucking community. And Thomas, the last week has been really fraught with news. It's been about a week since Hurricane Helene made landfall in the Big Bend of Florida. And unfortunately, the impacts from that storm are still waiting to be revealed in their fullness. We know one thing for sure, though. The FEMA loads have started flowing. It's the hurricane that people were wanting in the freight space, but nobody, of course, wanted this destruction to be this bad.
This is the worst place to... You would want to see volatility in the market, but what you don't want to see is places in North Carolina, especially those locations from a transport standpoint. It took out the roads. We didn't have... So there's a lot of concern. People on social media had commented, where's FEMA? Well, I-40 was down to one lane and it slid away. So you can't really get... when an event of this scale happens in a mountainous area and the roads are washed out because you can't build in that area. You're in the hollers, and the hollers hollered back and took out your roads. So we're going to see a disaster response. This is something that's going to take months. It's going to be ongoing. Entire communities are washed away. We're finally getting cell service. Expect more news as it develops. But from a logistics and supply chain standpoint, this one's going to be bad. And I think that drivers as well as fleets were used to the Gulf Coast, we're used to Florida, but with this location and how the storm played, the terrain is going to be the huge factor. It's not going to be easy.
So for rural people who don't live in the South and don't understand what rural Appalachia is like and have this idea of FEMA loads and relief moving in places like Florida or Texas or Louisiana, right? Those are Gulf Coast states where a lot of their highway infrastructure is 3 lanes on one side, so 6 lanes total of interstate, and their state and local highways are typically 2 lanes in and of themselves, 2 lanes on either side, so a 4-lane highway that are relatively straight, relatively flat. The majority of these areas that were affected by the rainfall of Hurricane Helene are 2-lane roads that wind through the mountains of rural Appalachia, most of them right next to a creek, a stream, a tributary, something that ended up flooding. So that makes the effort of driving in relief just absolutely larger than life, right? But I do want to mention really quickly, shout out before we move to our second topic of the day on this whole perfect storm scenario. I really want to shout out the drivers and the individuals who have stepped up outside of their freight or carrier requirements, right? Those carriers who maybe aren't necessarily booking FEMA loads, but have said, hey, you know what? I've got the presence here in the Southeast. I'm used to driving through this area. I run loads from, I-85 out through to 75 through Asheville all the time. I'm going to step up and take some time out of my own job to go out there and help. Thank you to those drivers. Thank you to all the logistics professionals who have started helping out here, because the South are, as much as we get a bad rap, coming together as a community in the South is something that is absolutely incredible to see. And thank you all from the logistics perspective who have started to do that.
Yeah, look to the helpers. These folks know the roads. It's a double whammy. The road may be cleared, but also the fundamentals. You're looking at clay, you're looking at soil compositions, the weight of these tractors. It is a lot more dangerous. It's not a simple task of just where's FEMA. Even airlift capabilities in mountainous, uneven terrain can be very difficult. I remember one of my buddies who's an Army pilot, when he was stationed in Korea, he said it wasn't the North Koreans that scared me, it was the power lines. Because mountainous regions in Korea, South Korea, had similar issues where the helicopters and the Blackhawks were coming in low, but then they'd have to worry about clipping the lines. We have similar conditions in the Carolinas with the Appalachians and the Smokies. And so big shout out to the responders, big shout out to the drivers who are stepping up. This is not an easy job. This is not going to be one of those. It needs to be more publicized. All the reporters showed up in Florida expecting the big one, but I do hope that we continue to keep them in our thoughts and prayers because, looking at some of the early reports, it looks like that wiped a few towns right off the map.
Yeah, and we'll also need to, of course, keep an eye out when it comes to freight markets themselves through southern Georgia, through the Augusta market, because they got hit pretty hard throughout Augusta and kind of in that southeastern Georgia range. Same thing through South Carolina. South Carolina had the most amount of people actually without power. They got kind of the double whammy of the hardest winds and the most rainfall together. So that's something to watch out for, and we're going to continue to see it. I guess maybe, a week or two before we really start to see it in the freight markets, just simply because, as we mentioned, through Asheville, you can't get loads moving there. So it's going to take a little bit to see the shakeup, but we're going to keep a watch on that. And speaking of playing the long game when it comes to seeing how this is going to impact freight, the ports are on strike. The ILA decided on midnight on a Tuesday to go ahead and say, you know what, we reject the 50% raise that has been offered by the groups of the ports, and they are officially on strike. Thomas, you said it before we went on air. If this reaches down to your area of expertise, the enterprise fleets, we are in big trouble.
Big problems. Yeah, that's so like, when we're looking at the early reports, there's a lot of great people who are in the maritime space. As our resident trucking expert, it's almost like I'm waiting to see if we make it to the second inning, the third inning, or the fourth inning, because the first week that we're dealing with, if the strikes continue on past a week, then we're going to start seeing like a spigot being cut off, the aftershocks. And in the trucking space, it does. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks for it to kind of matriculate and for us to really feel as if these volumes, similar to a natural disaster, those areas that are impacted in the Carolinas, it will take at least a week before the ripples get felt because, some shipments, we're waiting for the data. But yeah, by the time it gets to me, if we're having this conversation again next week, this is going to be a problem. But on my third community market update, I hope you bought toilet paper. I'm just going to
say that because it's going to make people actually legitimately panic and flash back to 2020.
Well, Walmart's looking at the East Coast ports. It's definitely Walmart, furniture makers, and a few others that are going to be the most exposed. I hope that this thing only lasts probably a week. It makes sense from a standpoint. These are 6-year contracts. The East Coast ports feel like they didn't get a good deal. They felt like their last contract was before COVID. They saw all this money being made, so they want that cut. They don't want any automation. The U.S. lags the world in terms of automation, so this is going to be something. It's hit right in the middle of an election season. This is one of the October surprises, and I think that it's such a we're in the very early stages. The problem with being the trucking expert is you got to give me a week or two. We don't move very fast in this area. You'll see the ports and stuff going off the rails, but I would probably wager that in the next 7 to 10 days we'll start to see some of the impacts. But it's bad for the market in the truckload carrier space.
So JB Hampstead wrote a really great white paper. Him and his research team put out a really great white paper on what the effect of the port strike could be. That did publish on September 27th. So last Friday, about a week ago. That was before the strike was actually enacted, but it does give some pretty good detailed numbers on what we could be looking at from a ripple down effect, depending on how long the strike lasts. We're looking at, every day causing about 3 to 4 weeks worth of ripple effect. So you're talking a week or longer. You're looking at effects that are pressing into the new year, right? Definitely an issue for Christmas. But I'm glad that you brought up Walmart specifically because they are one of the shippers that are most exposed to this risk because they import a lot of their goods specifically using the East and the Gulf Coast ports. They also happen to have their own private fleet.
Yep.
So if it does end up trickling down to them from a transportation perspective, they're holding on to a lot of exposure, but will that exposure necessarily be felt in the freight markets because Walmart is a private fleet?
Yes. That we've seen. So that was one of the things in the past year. The more I've been doing this job, the more impacts private fleets are having. Give you an example. There was a recent National Private Fleet Council study. Before the pandemic, 67% of all a shipper's freight was handled by their private fleet. Now it's up to 75%. So we have a double whammy. We have a situation where a Walmart and a large customer is like, I want to haul more of this on my own trucks because I don't want to get screwed over again. At the same time, when those trucks don't have freight because Walmart can't pick up the loads and bring to their distribution centers, they're going to get on the spot market to stay busy. The truck payment doesn't stop. There's a theoretical, we're talking very theoretical in the early stages of the game here, that private fleets and public fleets that service those customers will dip into the spot market, further depressing spot rates. They have to find something to keep moving. So there's a huge risk to that. We will have to see how this plays out. But from a theoretical standpoint, that should be the behavior that we see. Operationally, I do the same thing. If I was an analyst, imagine that you show up and you're used to having a market that your bucket is full. And now because of the port strikes, you're 300 loads shy. I don't care what the rate is. When I'm 300 loads shy, let's pause. Put in the sound bite. When we're less 300 loads on a 1,000 truck fleet, I don't care what the rate is. We're going to pause for a second because if you're a small fleet who has to care what the rate is, I'm sorry, but I'm going to run it. I don't care if it's 75 cents.
Wow.
It's just nothing personal. It's just business. The market was not prepared for this kind of behavior. And if we do see it, we would see it in terms of in the next 2 to 3 weeks, a massive crater in spot rates as we look to find other things.
So is this the low part of the catalyst needed for a whiplash return? That's the million. That's not the $1 million question. That's like the $5 billion per day question.
It will. It's the big question. We won't know till January, February, because what's going to happen is all the fourth quarter, all the peak season, everything else. I mean, we haven't had this since 77. I don't think there's a data model I can go back. We're in the blind here, folks. I'm not going to sugarcoat it here because the last time they striked was 1977, and that's before the Motor Carrier Act of 1980. This is the first time in our market, like fundamentally in our market, that like we have had a situation where we've had a mass freight casualty event. Where's the freight? It's going to be gone. So we got to wait and see. That is the now multi-billion-dollar question is we don't know.
There we go. If someone had a magic ball that could shake it out, that's always the joke that's here, right? All right, Thomas, really quickly before we let you go, your guest for the week, who was it and where can we find them?
Check it out. Loaded and Rolling. It went live Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern, talking with the folks of Freight Science. Matt Foster, always a fun conversation, talking about load tenders. A very big topic, by the way, because with ports shut down, where's my tenders at? Where do I find my tenders? I have to get tenders elsewhere. Will I find them? Stay tuned.
There we go. All right, Thomas, thank you for joining us this morning. You can find Loaded and Rolling the show on Tuesday afternoons. Find it wherever you get your podcasts, watch your replays on YouTube, and go subscribe to that Loaded and Rolling newsletter as well. Even with the port strike, we are still about a month away from the Future Freight Festival. No strikes here. So go subscribe to the newsletter, get that special little discount code. We'll see you guys in November, and have a great rest of your day.